The Neighbour Who Watered the Roses, a Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Empty Chair. The fog came up from the river at 4 o'clock, the way it always did in Wren's Hollow in October, curling round the lich gate and softening the church clock to a smear of gold. By 4:30 it had reached the post office window, where a small hand-lettered card had hung since noon, back in 10 minutes. It was still hanging there at 6. Mrs. Doreen Ashby noticed first, because she had come for stamps and a stern word about a parcel gone astray, and found instead a locked door and a light burning uselessly behind drawn curtains. She rattled the handle twice, pressed her nose to the gap in the curtain, and saw nothing but the ordinary clutter of the counter, the brass scale, the string ball, the ledger open to a half-finished page. She did not think, at first, that anything was wrong. Ivy Colgate was not a woman who invited worry. She was punctual to the point of tedium, the kind of person whose absence felt less like danger than like bad manners. By 7, when the vicar's wife came for her evening paper and found the same locked door, bad manners had curdled into something else. It was Miss Prudence Marple, small, upright, 71 years old, with the sort of pale blue eyes that seemed to have spent a lifetime cataloguing exactly how far people would go to avoid an inconvenient truth, who suggested, mildly, that someone ought to fetch the spare key from Mr. Colgate's sister in Netherfield Lane. "I shouldn't think it's anything," she said, winding her grey wool scarf twice about her throat. "But I have always found that the most uneventful explanations rarely explain an entirely locked door and a lit lamp." Nobody paid this much attention. Miss Marple had taught the village school for 31 years, and most of Wren's Hollow still thought of her, faintly and fondly, as somebody's old teacher, a woman for reciting poetry and marking sums, not for anything so serious as a locked door in the fog. They found Ivy Colgate in the back parlour behind the shop, in her usual chair by the black iron stove, a cup of tea gone quite cold on the little table at her elbow, and a slice of bread and butter, with one bite taken from it, lying on a plate beside a jar of her own blackberry preserve. She was, by every appearance, simply asleep. She was not asleep. Dr. Instone arrived within the half-hour, brought by young Tommy Yarrow on his bicycle, and it did not take him long, a glance at her lips, a lift of one still hand, to say the word that changed the shape of the evening entirely. "Poison," he said, quietly enough that the two women crowded in the doorway did not quite catch it, though they caught the look on his face, which told them just as much. Miss Marple, standing a little apart near the window, did not go to look at the body. She had seen death before. The war had made sure of that, in its slow, attritional way, taking husbands and brothers and once, very early on, a favourite pupil, and she did not think there was anything to be learned by staring at what remained of a woman once the woman herself had gone out of it. Instead, she looked at the tea things. The cup was 3/4 full. The bread and butter had one bite taken from it, a small, neat bite, the kind a person takes when they are not especially hungry, only doing what is expected before tea. The jar of preserve stood open beside the plate, a knife laid across its rim at an angle that struck Miss Marple, for reasons she could not yet have named, as very slightly wrong. "How very sad," said Mrs. Ashby from the doorway, in the hushed and faintly thrilled voice people use for other people's tragedies. "She must have taken a funny turn, her heart, perhaps." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, and said nothing else, because it was not yet the moment to say that hearts do not, as a rule, arrange a knife so precisely across the rim of a jam jar before they stop. Chapter 2. What the Village Said. By the following morning the fog had lifted, but the talk had not, and it moved through Wren's Hollow with the particular speed of village conversation, which travels faster than any known form of transport, and arrives everywhere slightly altered. At the baker's, it was agreed that Ivy Colgate had a weak heart, though nobody could quite say who had told them so. At the Bell and Plough, it was agreed instead that she had been low in spirits since the summer, and had perhaps taken something she oughtn't, though this too traced back to no particular source beyond a general fondness, among certain regulars, for a tidy and dramatic explanation. Constable Purbrick, a broad young man only 2 years into the job and entirely unused to anything grander than a bicycle theft, had sealed the post office and sent word to the county police, and was now standing rather helplessly at the counter of the Hollow stores, trying to look as though he knew precisely what ought to happen next. Miss Marple found him there at 9:30, buying a paper of pins for his mother and trying not to appear as though half the village were watching him do it. "A dreadful business," she said, by way of greeting, setting her basket on the counter. "I don't suppose the doctor has said yet what it was." "Can't rightly say, Miss Marple." He lowered his voice, though the shop had only one other customer, deep in the tinned goods. "Something in her tea, the doctor thinks, or the preserve. They've sent it all off to be looked at properly." "The preserve," Miss Marple repeated, and something in her tone made the young constable glance at her more sharply. "That would be her own, I suppose. She was a great one for jam." "So I'm told." He hesitated. "Funny thing, though. Dr. Instone says there wasn't hardly enough tea drunk, nor bread eaten, for it to have done for her as quickly as it did. Whatever it was, it must have been strong." Miss Marple thought about this while she selected a ball of darning wool she did not particularly need, and paid for it, and thanked the shopkeeper, Mr. Prentice, by name, a habit of hers, thanking people by name, which had the useful side effect of making them remember, afterward, precisely what had been said in front of her. She thought about it further on her walk home, past the green where the harvest bunting from last week's fete still hung a little forlornly between the chestnut trees, waiting to be taken down for the harvest supper at month's end. It was, she reflected, an odd sort of village to kill someone in. Wren's Hollow prided itself on being uneventful, a huddle of grey stone cottages around a green, a church with a crooked spire, a river that flooded politely once a year and then apologised for it by producing excellent watercress. People here did not, as a rule, do anything so operatic as murder, and yet someone had put something into Ivy Colgate's jam, or her tea, or both, and had done it with enough care that the postmistress had died alone, behind a locked door, without so much as knocking over her cup. That, Miss Marple thought, walking past the low stone wall of her own garden, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies were going brown at the edges, was not the work of an accident. It was the work of somebody who had known Ivy Colgate's habits very well indeed, well enough to know she took her tea alone in the back parlour every evening at 5:30, with a slice of bread and butter and a spoonful of her own preserve, precisely as she had done for 11 years. That narrowed the field a good deal. It did not, unfortunately, narrow it to fewer than half the village. She let herself in through her own front gate, past the rose bed she had been meaning to prune, and paused there a moment, frowning slightly, at nothing in particular, or at nothing she could yet put a name to. Chapter 3. The Roses Next Door. It was, in fact, the roses that gave her the first thread to pull, though it would be some days before she understood she had already picked it up. Miss Marple's cottage stood at the end of Church Lane, its garden separated by only a low wall and a gap in the privet from the garden of her neighbour, Mr. Walter Sedge, a widower of some 50 years, who had moved to Wren's Hollow some 3 years before, and who grew, with a devotion that bordered on the religious, an exceptional bed of hybrid tea roses. It was Mr. Sedge's habit, every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, to water those roses, not before, not after, but at 6 precisely, with a green watering can he filled twice from the standpipe by his back door. Miss Marple had observed this ritual for 3 years from her kitchen window, along with the sparrows and the postman, and a great deal else that passed along Church Lane, without once thinking it meant anything at all beyond a man's fondness for punctuality and Papa Mealand roses. On the evening Ivy Colgate died, Mr. Sedge had not watered his roses at 6. Miss Marple discovered this not through any great feat of deduction, but through the much more ordinary means of Mrs. Prowse, who did for both of them on alternate mornings, and who remarked, while beating the hall rugs over Miss Marple's garden wall 2 days after the death, that poor Mr. Sedge had been all anyhow that evening, and hadn't done his roses till gone 7, which isn't like him at all, Miss Marple, not like him one bit. "Isn't it?" said Miss Marple, in the mild, encouraging tone she had once used to draw out reluctant answers from 9-year-olds. and which worked, she found, almost as well on grown women with rugs to beat. No, indeed. I said to him, "Mr. Sedge," I said, "you're very late with your watering tonight." And he looked at me most peculiarly and said he'd been held up. Held up! In Wren's Hollow, at 6 o'clock in the evening, I ask you. Miss Marple asked nobody, least of all herself, out loud. But she turned the fact over that evening as she sat by her own fire with her knitting, the way she turned over most facts, slowly, without hurry, the way one turns a stone to see what is living underneath it. Mr. Sedge's garden is backed by a path along the churchyard wall, almost directly onto the lane behind the post office. A man walking briskly could go from his own back gate to Ivy Colgate's back door in perhaps 90 seconds, and back again in another 90, and still have time to spare before his roses wanted watering, if his roses were watered at their ordinary hour. If they were watered an hour late, one might ask why. Miss Marple did not, at this stage, ask why Mr. Sedge himself. She had learned, over 3 decades of drawing truth out of children too young to have perfected the art of lying, that a direct question asked too early only taught the asker what evasions looked like, without teaching them anything true. Better to wait, better to let a fact sit quietly in a room and see what grew up around it. She did, however, take her basket the following afternoon and walk the long way round to the shop, past Mr. Sedge's garden gate, where she found him kneeling among his roses with a pair of secateurs, looking, she thought, rather more tired than a man tends to look after only 2 days of ordinary grief for a neighbour. "Lovely lot you've got this year, Mr. Sedge," she said, pausing at the gate, "though I think that Papa Mealand wants dead-heading." He looked up, and there was— Miss Marple noted it and set it carefully aside, the way she set aside a stray fact until she had somewhere proper to put it, a half-second of something that was not quite alarm and not quite guilt, but stood a little too close to both to be simple politeness. "So it does," he said, and smiled, and the smile arrived a beat too late to be entirely comfortable. "You've a sharper eye than I have, Miss Marple." "Oh, I doubt that very much," said Miss Marple pleasantly, and went on her way, leaving him to his roses, and whatever it was that had kept him from them, for one evening only, at the hour Ivy Colgate had begun, quietly and without fuss, to die. Chapter 4. The inspector from the County Detective Inspector Alan Merrow arrived from the county town on Thursday in a car that took the last half-mile of potholed lane at a speed that suggested he did not much care for villages, fog, or the general slowness of rural death. He was a tall, sharp-faced man of perhaps 45, with the particular impatience of someone who has solved a great many ordinary crimes and expects this one to be ordinary too. A jealous husband, a debt unpaid, something with an obvious shape once you leaned on it hard enough. He set up his temporary office in the back room of the Bell and Plough, requisitioned Constable Purbrick as a sort of nervous secretary, and began, with commendable efficiency, to work his way through the post office ledgers, the contents of Ivy Colgate's rooms, and the list, growing longer with every hour, of people who might, for one reason or another, have wished her ill. It was, by the second day, a longer list than anyone had expected. Ivy Colgate had run the post office for 11 years with a thoroughness that made her, by unfortunate necessity, one of the best-informed women in Wren's Hollow. She sorted the letters. She noticed the telegrams. She had, everyone agreed, an excellent memory for which household received post from which town, and how often, and in what sort of hand. It was this Inspector Merrow began to suspect, rather than any weak heart or funny turn, that had got her killed. She was a collector, he said to Miss Marple, on the Friday afternoon, in the somewhat unorthodox circumstance of finding himself taking tea in her front parlour, a state of affairs arrived at because the vicar, a nervous man named Mr. Aldous Pym, had mentioned to him, in the manner of a confession, that if the inspector wanted to understand Wren's Hollow, he had far better talk to Miss Marple than to the vicar himself. Merrow had gone, expecting an eccentric old woman with theories about the vicar's cat. He found instead a small, neat sitting-room, a very good pot of tea, and a hostess whose questions, he noticed rather quickly, were considerably better than his own. A collector of what, Inspector? Information. Little things. We've found a locked box in her bedroom, letters, mostly, and some notes in her own hand. Dates, amount of money. Doesn't mean much on its own, but it means a good deal put together. He accepted a second scone with the air of a man who had not eaten properly in 2 days. I think Ivy Colgate had made rather a habit of knowing things about people that they'd have preferred she didn't, and I think one of them decided she'd gone on knowing them for quite long enough. Blackmail, said Miss Marple, without any particular horror in her voice, the way she might have said, influenza. I don't like the word before I've proof of it, but yes, something of that shape. How very sad, said Miss Marple, meaning it, and reached for the teapot. One does hate to think of it. A woman alone, running a little shop for 11 years, and turning, somewhere along the way, into that. I wonder what made her start. Money, generally, or spite, sometimes both. Merrow watched her pour, with the faint suspicion of a man who has begun to realize he is not, after all, the cleverest person in the room, and does not yet know quite what to do about it. You knew her well, Miss Marple, as well as anyone knows a postmistress, I imagine, which is to say, I knew her habits far better than I knew her heart. She took her tea at 5:30, always alone, always in the back parlour. She was fond of her own blackberry preserve, and rather too free with her opinions on other people's parcels. And she was, Miss Marple added, setting down the pot, extremely regular. That is the thing I keep returning to, Inspector. Whoever did this knew exactly when to find her, exactly where she would be, doing exactly what she always did. That is not a stranger's crime. That is a neighbour's crime. Chapter 5. The list grows longer. By the end of the week, Inspector Merrow had assembled, with Constable Purbrick's earnest and slightly overwhelmed assistance, a list of 8 names, people who appeared, in one way or another, in the contents of Ivy Colgate's locked box, or in the pattern of who had cause to fear what she knew. There was Mr. Walter Sedge, the rose-growing widower, whose lateness to his own garden on the fatal evening had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple, and who turned out, on closer inspection of the ledger, to have received rather more registered post from a London solicitor than a retired schoolmaster of modest means generally required. There was Mrs. Doreen Ashby, whose stern word about a lost parcel had been, it emerged, considerably stranger than a lost parcel. She had accused Ivy Colgate, in a heated exchange the week before, of opening and reading a private letter, an accusation Ivy had denied, with what several witnesses described as unconvincing warmth. There was young Tommy Yarrow's father, Sam Yarrow, the village builder, who had once, some years before, done rather badly out of a business arrangement that Ivy Colgate, through her privileged view of every letter passing through the village, had known a good deal more about than she ought. There was Miss Colgate's own niece, a sharp, unhappy young woman named Netta Pryor, who had come to live with her aunt some months before, and stood, by the terms of a small but real will, to inherit the shop and the cottage behind it. There was the vicar, Mr. Pym, whose finances, it emerged from the ledger, had been in a curious state of improvement over the past year, despite a stipend that had not changed at all. There was Dr. Instone himself, who had signed, some years back, a death certificate for an elderly patient, under circumstances that a sharp-eyed postmistress, sorting the resulting correspondence, might have found worth remembering. There was the schoolmaster who had succeeded Miss Marple, a young man named Peter Coyle, newly arrived and newly, unhappily, in debt to persons in the county town that a postmistress's ledger of money orders might easily have revealed. And there was Miss Marple herself, though nobody was foolish enough to say so aloud, except Miss Marple, who said it to the inspector directly, over the last of the scones, with a dryness that made him choke slightly on his tea. You may as well add me to your list, Inspector. I have lived alone at the end of Church Lane for 11 years. I know a great many secrets I have never troubled to use, and I have every opportunity a neighbour has. I only offer this so that you do not waste an afternoon working up to it delicately. I hadn't thought, Merrow began, and stopped, because he had in fact thought it, briefly, on his first evening in the village, before dismissing it within the same breath. You had, and quite rightly. It is always the retired schoolmistress in these things, Inspector, or so I understand from the wireless serials. But I think you will find I have an alibi of the dullest possible kind. I was at the vicarage, helping Mrs. Pym address the harvest supper invitations, from 4 o'clock until well past 7, in the company of at least 6 other women, none of whom I imagine you'll have much trouble believing over me. Merrow, checking this the following day, found it entirely true, and crossed her name off his list with something that might, in a less professionally guarded man, have looked like relief. Miss Marple did not cross herself off her own list. She was not, in fact, thinking about herself at all. She was thinking about 8 names on a table, and one small, wrong-angled knife across the rim of a jam jar, and a rose bed that had waited an hour past its ordinary hour to be watered. Chapter 6. A second fright. The second shock, when it came, arrived not as a death, but as something nearly as unsettling, a fire, small and swiftly put out, that broke out in the back parlour of the post office on the Sunday night, in the very room where Ivy Colgate had died. It was Constable Purbrick's own vigilance that caught it. He had taken to walking past the sealed shop each evening on his round, out of a diligence his superiors had not strictly required of him, and it was the smell of smoke, faint but wrong on the cold night air, that sent him vaulting the back wall to find flames already licking up the edge of the dresser where Ivy Colgate had kept, among her china, the very locked box the inspector had removed only 3 days before. The box itself was gone, safely under lock at the Bell and Plough, but the dresser had held other things, old letters, receipts, the ordinary detritus of a careful woman's life, and a good deal of that had been burned before Purbrick, and 2 men from the Bell managed to beat it out with wet sacking. Somebody wanted something gone, Merrow said grimly, standing in the singed and sodden parlour the next morning, and didn't know we'd already taken the box. Or knew and wanted something else that was in the dresser instead, said Miss Marple, who had been permitted into the parlour on the strength of the vicar's earlier recommendation and her own quiet insistence that she had, after all, discovered the original scene and might notice something amiss in it a second time. Such as? I don't yet know, but I should be very interested to learn whether the fire started at the dresser itself or was carried there. A lamp knocked over would char in one pattern, a match set deliberately in quite another. She crouched, with some difficulty and no complaint, to examine the blackened boards. This has burned upward and outward from a single low point, Inspector, close by the floor, in a manner I don't think an overturned lamp would manage on its own. Someone knelt here and set a small fire on purpose, low down, meaning it to spread slowly and be taken, if discovered at all, for an accident. Merrow crouched beside her, and for once did not argue. Whoever it was, Miss Marple went on, straightening with the aid of his offered hand, knew the shop was sealed, and knew, or guessed, that a constable's round would eventually bring someone past it, which suggests either remarkable carelessness or someone who wanted the fire found before it did real damage. A message, perhaps, rather than a true attempt at destruction, or a search, interrupted before it could be tidied away, and covered afterward with flame in a hurry. A search for what? That, said Miss Marple, is what I should like to know most of all, because I think whoever set this fire is the same person who put something in Ivy Colgate's jam, and I think they are considerably more frightened now than they were a week ago. Frightened people, Inspector, are not safer than calm ones. They are only less predictable. She looked round the ruined little room once more, at the char-blackened dresser, the sodden rag rug, the china saved and stacked in a careful pile by Purbrick's hand, and her pale eyes rested, for a moment, on the back door, which gave by the shortest possible path onto the lane that ran behind Mr. Sedge's garden wall. Chapter 7. The Solicitor's Letter. Inspector Merrow spent the Monday afternoon on the telephone to London, and returned to the Bell and Plough with the particular satisfaction of a man who had confirmed a suspicion he had been reluctant to voice. The registered letters to Mr. Walter Sedge, it transpired, came from a firm of solicitors handling the estate of a Mrs. Constance Whitlow, a widow who had died in Surrey some 18 months before, leaving behind a modest fortune and a rather more complicated question of who, precisely, was entitled to it. "Sedge isn't his real name," Merrow said, laying the telegram flat on the table for Miss Marple to read, having by now abandoned any pretense that he did not want her opinion on these things. "Or rather, it is, but it isn't the whole of it. He was born Walter Sedgwick Whitlow, Mrs. Whitlow's nephew, and, until 18 months ago, her presumed heir, before she cut him out of her will entirely and left the bulk of it to a cousin he'd never met." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple, who did not think it interesting in the least surprising sense. She had, in fact, half expected some such shape to the thing since the evening of the roses, but who found it interesting in the way that a missing piece is interesting when it slides at last into a puzzle. "And I don't suppose the solicitors have said why she cut him out. Not in so many words, but there's a hint of it in the last letter, something about the matter you know of, which I have not forgotten, whatever you may hope. Sounds like the old lady knew something about her nephew that she didn't care for. And if Ivy Colgate, sorting the post of a man calling himself Walter Sedge for 3 years, happened to notice letters addressed, now and again, to a Walter Sedgwick Whitlow, she'd have wondered why a widower with a modest pension was corresponding with London solicitors about a dead woman's estate. And being the sort of woman she was, she'd have found out why, and kept what she found." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and considered this with the calm, unhurried attention she gave to most things, from difficult sums to difficult people. "It gives him a reason to fear her, Inspector, which is not quite the same as giving him a reason to kill her. Men do not generally poison their neighbours simply because those neighbours know an inconvenient fact about an inheritance. There would have to be more at stake than embarrassment. Money, certainly, but more than money. Something Mrs. Whitlow's solicitors might act on, if it reached them. Something criminal, perhaps, rather than merely unflattering. You think there's more to it than the money?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that a man who changes half his name and settles quietly in a village 3 counties from where he was born is not merely avoiding embarrassment. He is avoiding recognition. And I would very much like to know what Mrs. Whitlow's matter you know of actually was, before I decide how much weight to put on Mr. Sedge and his late roses." Merrow, to his credit, did not dismiss this. He put in a second call to London before the day was out, and spent the evening waiting with visibly poor patience for an answer that did not come until the following morning, by which time an event had occurred that made the question for one dreadful hour seem very much less important than it had. Chapter 8. Netta Pryor's Secret. It was Netta Pryor, Ivy Colgate's niece, sharp-faced and 24, and by the terms of a small will, now the owner of a shop she had lived in for less than a year, who came to Miss Marple's door on the Tuesday morning, without an appointment, without a coat despite the cold, and with the particular white, set look of someone who has decided, after several sleepless nights, that she can no longer carry a thing alone. "They think it was me," she said, before Miss Marple had properly got the door open. "I know they do. I'm the one who gets the shop, aren't I? Now it's happened. I saw the way that Inspector looked at me. Come in, my dear, and sit down, and we shall have some tea before we discuss what anyone thinks of anybody." Miss Marple said this in the tone she had once used on children who arrived at school in a state of tears over a lost exercise book, brisk, kind, and entirely unimpressed by panic, which had the reliable effect of reducing it. It took the better part of a pot of tea and a good deal of patient silence before Netta Pryor said what she had, plainly, come to say. "I didn't kill her. I want that said first, whatever you think of the rest of it. But I lied to the inspector, and I think I have to tell somebody the truth of it before he finds it out on his own and thinks the worse of me for the lie, as well as everything else. Go on." "I told him I was at the pictures in Netherfield on Wednesday evening, from 5 till gone 8. I wasn't. I was in Wren's Hollow the whole time. I went out, but I didn't go to Netherfield at all. I went to meet somebody, and I don't want to say who, because it isn't the sort of thing a girl says out loud in a village like this one." Miss Marple, who had taught enough young women over 3 decades to recognize the particular shame that attaches itself to entirely ordinary things when a small place decides to be scandalized by them, did not press. She simply waited, refilling the girl's cup, until the rest came of its own accord. I was meeting Peter, Mr. Coyle, the new schoolmaster. We've been walking out since the summer, only quietly, because his last position ended badly, and he didn't want talk following him here before he'd properly settled, and I didn't want Aunt Ivy knowing, because she'd have had opinions, and Aunt Ivy's opinions had a way of becoming everyone's opinions within a day. And where were you and Mr. Coyle on the Wednesday evening, between 5 and 8? Walking along the river path, past the old mill, and back by the lane behind the churchyard, the one that runs past Mr. Sedge's garden. Netta's hands tightened round her cup. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I've thought of nothing else since, because we passed his gate it must have been near 6 or a little after, and Mr. Sedge wasn't there. His can was standing by the standpipe, filled, as if he'd meant to start, but he wasn't in the garden at all. Miss Marple set down her own cup with great care, as though it, and not the information just given, were the fragile thing in the room. You are quite certain of the time? I heard the church clock strike the half-hour just after 6:30, and I remember thinking how odd it was, him not there, because he's always there of an evening, like clockwork. I didn't think anything more of it till the fire, and then I couldn't stop thinking of it. And did Mr. Coyle see the same thing? He must have. We were together the whole walk. Netta looked up, and something in her face sharpened into a kind of frightened clarity. You don't think, Miss Marple, you don't think it was him, do you, Mr. Sedge? Because if it was, and I've been keeping quiet about seeing him not there, all this time, out of nothing but wanting to keep my own business private, I think, said Miss Marple gently, that you have done a foolish thing in a very understandable way, and that you must go to Inspector Merrow this afternoon and tell him precisely what you have told me, all of it, the walking out with Mr. Coyle included, because a lie half corrected is very often more dangerous than the truth would ever have been. As for Mr. Sedge, I think a good many things, my dear, and I am not yet ready to say which of them is the true one. Chapter 9. What the solicitor knew. The answer from London, when it finally came through to Inspector Merrow on the Wednesday, was longer and stranger than he had expected, and he brought it directly to Miss Marple's parlour without troubling to disguise, this time, that he had come for her opinion as much as to deliver news. Mrs. Whitlow's solicitor was cagey on the telephone, but I pressed him, and here's the shape of it. Walter Sedgwick Whitlow was named in her will as principal heir for the better part of 20 years, right up until 18 months before she died, when she changed it without warning and cut him to almost nothing. The solicitor didn't know why, not exactly, but he remembered her saying something, at the time, about never trusting a man who'd let another man hang for his own debts. Hang, Miss Marple repeated, very quietly. A figure of speech, presumably. Nobody's actually hanged over a debt in this country in a long while. But there was, it turns out, an incident. Some years back, before the war this would be, a business partner of the young Whitlows went to prison over a matter of fraudulent accounts. A small building firm, some misappropriated funds. The partner served 18 months. Whitlow himself was never charged. And Mrs. Whitlow believed, I take it, that her nephew was the one truly responsible and had let his partner take the blame for it. That's my reading of it too. She never proved it. Nothing was ever proved, or the young man wouldn't have gone to prison instead of Whitlow, but she came to believe it, strongly enough to change her will over it. And if that's the sort of thing hanging over a man's head, Miss Marple, and a nosy postmistress somehow got wind of it, then he would have a very great deal to lose, should it come to light in a village where he had rebuilt an entirely respectable life under half a false name. Miss Marple folded her hands. It is a strong motive, Inspector. I do not say it is not, but I find myself troubled by one small thing, and I wonder if you would indulge me in it. Go on. You have told me Mr. Sedge was absent from his garden at 6:30 on Wednesday evening. Miss Pryor's account confirms it, and I do not think she has any reason to invent such a detail against a man she has nothing whatsoever against. But Dr. Instone's estimate, when he first examined poor Miss Collegate, placed her death considerably earlier, nearer to 5:30, when she would first have sat down to her tea. If the poison was in the preserve itself, and she ate her bread and butter with it at 5:30, as she always did, then whoever placed that poison in the jar must have done so before that hour, not at 6:30, when Mr. Sedge was seen to be absent from his garden. Merrow frowned. "You're saying his absence doesn't fit the time of death." "I am saying it fits a great many things very neatly. Burning documents, fleeing a scene, a man in a state of guilty agitation, but it does not, on its own, fit the one thing that actually matters, which is the precise hour the poison was administered. A man who was absent from his garden at 6:30 might have been anywhere at all, doing anything at all, entirely unconnected with a death that had already occurred an hour before. I only observe, Inspector, that we have been rather too pleased with an explanation that fits our suspicion, and not quite pleased enough with an explanation that fits the facts." Chapter 10. The Schoolmaster's Debt. Inspector Merrow's next call was on Peter Coyle, and Miss Marple, invited along on the strength of having taught in the very schoolhouse he now occupied, watched the young man's face while the inspector laid out, without much ceremony, what he had learned of debts owed to a moneylender in the county town. Coyle did not deny it. He seemed, if anything, relieved to have it out in the open. "I borrowed against my last quarter's salary before I'd properly moved here," he said, twisting his hands in his lap. "A stupid business. Cards, mostly, at my old college. I've been paying it off in installments ever since, and I didn't want it known, because a schoolmaster with debts doesn't inspire confidence in a school board. But I never borrowed a penny from Miss Colgate, and I never had cause to fear her over it. If she knew of the money orders I sent to Netherfield each month, she never once said a word to me about it. And on Wednesday evening, walking with Netta, she's told you that herself, I imagine, by now." He glanced, briefly, almost pleadingly, at Miss Marple. "I know it looks bad, the two of us are keeping quiet about it, but there was nothing worse than two people not wanting the whole village discussing their business before they'd decided what that business was." Miss Marple, listening, found herself inclined to believe him, not from any softness toward young lovers, of which she had rather less than most, but because his account matched Netta's in every particular, down to the church clock striking 6:30 as they passed Mr. Sedge's empty garden, and matching accounts given separately and without collusion were, in her long experience, considerably more trustworthy than any amount of protested innocence. "I think," she said to Merrow afterward, as they walked back along the lane toward the green, "that we may set Mr. Coyle and Miss Pryor gently to one side, Inspector. Whatever secrets they were keeping them from each other's neighbours, not from Ivy Colgate. It is not, I think, the shape of a killer's secret. That's two crossed off then. Sedge still troubles me, though." "Sedge troubles me too," Miss Marple admitted, "but not, I think, for murder." Chapter 11. Mrs. Ashby's Letter. Mrs. Doreen Ashby received Inspector Merrow in her front room with the wounded dignity of a woman who felt she had already been quite sufficiently discussed, and answered his questions about the accusation of an opened letter with a heat that suggested the grievance, whatever it had been, was entirely genuine and entirely small. "My sister writes to me from Bristol, Inspector, and there are things in a sister's letter that are nobody's business but hers and mine, and I found the flap of that letter loose when it came to me, loose in a way it hadn't any right to be. I said as much to Ivy Colgate, and she denied it flatly, and we did not speak civilly again after that, but I did not poison the woman over a licked flap of gum, whatever anybody in this village might like to think. She had, it transpired, been at her sister's in Bristol herself for the whole of the Wednesday, returning only on the Thursday morning, a fact so easily and thoroughly confirmed by the railway booking office and her sister's own testimony that Merrow struck her name from the list within the hour, with something like an apology for having troubled her at all. "A grudge over a letter," Miss Marple observed, when he reported this to her that evening, "is precisely the sort of small, real unhappiness that makes a village feel alive with intrigue, and precisely the sort that almost never ends in poison. People do not generally kill over a licked envelope, Inspector. They kill, when they kill at all, over something they cannot bear to have known, not something they are merely embarrassed to have discussed." Chapter 12. The Vicar's Improved Fortunes. Mr. Aldous Pym, when the inspector called at the vicarage, proved so anxious to explain himself that he had very nearly finished doing so before Merrow had got his notebook out. "It is my aunt," the vicar said, colouring faintly. "My late aunt in Shropshire. She left me a small legacy in the spring, and I have been using it, rather secretly, I confess, toward the roof fund, because I did not want the parish thinking their vicar had come suddenly into money he ought to be sharing more publicly, and because a roof fund announced too soon invites every builder in the county to inflate his estimate. I have receipts, Inspector, for every penny. Sam Yarrow has been doing the slate work, very quietly, on my instruction. This too checked out within the day, to Merrow's evident and growing frustration, a frustration Miss Marple did not entirely share, for she had begun to suspect, some days before, that the case would not be solved by finding the suspect with the most dramatic secret, but by finding the one secret that fit the small, unglamorous facts of the crime itself. "You are disappointed, Inspector," she said, when he called on her that evening, in a mood she could only describe as thwarted. "I've 8 suspects and I'm down to 3, and not one of the remaining 3 fits as neatly as I'd like. Sedge with his motive and no proper time. Instone with an alibi I haven't even properly tested, because who suspects the doctor who calls it poison in the first place? And Sam Yarrow, whom I haven't even got round to yet." "Then let us go round to him," said Miss Marple. "And while we walk, Inspector, I wonder if you would indulge me by telling me again, very precisely, exactly what Dr. Instone told you, that first evening, about the time of Miss Colgate's death, and exactly how he came to that conclusion." Chapter 13. The Cup Without Milk. Sam Yarrow, the builder, proved to be a bluff, straightforward man whose old business trouble, a partner's fraud, some years back, that had briefly threatened his own reputation before the truth came out and cleared him entirely, turned out to be a matter of public record he was perfectly willing to discuss, and which Ivy Colgate had known of only because half the village had known of it at the time. "No secret there at all, Inspector," he said, with the particular ease of an honest man discussing an old, resolved trouble. "Ask anyone. I'll not pretend I liked the woman too much. She'd a sharp tongue for other folks' business, but I'd poison her more than I'd poison my own tea." It was, Miss Marple thought, watching Merrow cross a third name from his list, precisely the sort of interview that clarified matters by narrowing rather than by discovering, and it left, at the end of it, only 2 names of any real weight: Walter Sedge, with his changed name and his absent garden, and Dr. Instone, whom nobody, in 8 days of investigation, had thought seriously to suspect at all. It was that evening, walking home from the Yarrows along Church Lane in the last grey light, that Miss Marple stopped quite suddenly at her own gate, one hand on the cold iron, and stood very still for perhaps half a minute. "Inspector," she said, "I would like you to tell me again what was found on the tea-table beside Miss Colgate. Precisely, not what you inferred from it, what was there." Merrow consulted his notebook, faintly puzzled. Cup of tea, 3/4 full, gone cold. Bread and butter, 1 bite taken. Jar of blackberry preserve, open, knife across the rim. Sugar bowl, lid on. That's the whole of it. The sugar bowl, lid on. Miss Marple's eyes had gone very sharp and very still. "Inspector, Ivy Colgate took milk in her tea. Everyone in this village knows it. She complained of it to Mr. Prentice at the shop, not a fortnight before her death, that the dairy's milk had gone off, and she'd had to take her tea black 3 days running, and hated every drop of it." "Was there a milk jug on that table?" Merrow looked back through his own notes, and his face changed slowly as he did so. "No," he said. "No jug. I hadn't thought of it. There wasn't milk in the cup, but I put that down to her taking it black that week, same as you've just said. Except the dairy trouble was a fortnight before, Inspector, and Mr. Prentice himself told me only 3 days ago that the new delivery had been running sweet and thick as cream since the very start of this month. I remarked on it myself, buying a jug of it not 2 days before Miss Colgate died. She would have had good milk in her larder, milk she was glad to have back. A woman does not sit down at 5:30 for her ordinary solitary tea with good milk not 4 steps away in her own larder, and take it black, unless somebody else made that tea for her, Merrow said slowly, and didn't know her habits well enough to fetch the milk, or didn't want to take the extra minute doing it. Or, said Miss Marple, very quietly, unless the tea was made in some haste by someone who was thinking a great deal harder about what he was putting into the preserve than about what he was leaving out of the cup. Chapter 14. The Absent Milk. Dr. Instone had told Merrow on that first foggy evening that he had come only after Tommy Yarrow fetched him, that he had found Ivy Colgate already dead, examined her only enough to be certain of it, and sent at once for the police. It was a simple account, and nobody, in the shock of a first death, had thought to question it. Miss Marple thought of it now with rather different eyes. "You told me, Inspector, that Dr. Instone's own alibi for the earlier hour of that evening was that he was making his rounds, visiting old Mrs. Cotter with her rheumatism, and afterward the Frampton's baby with its cough. Has anyone actually confirmed the times of those visits, or have we simply taken a doctor's word for a doctor's movements, because it did not occur to us to doubt the man who told us there had been a murder at all?" Merrow's jaw tightened. "We took his word for it. He's not a man anyone thinks to check." "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely why he is worth checking now." It took Constable Purbrick the better part of a morning to establish, gently and without alarming anyone, that Mrs. Cotter recalled the doctor's visit as having been considerably shorter than usual, and considerably earlier, nearer to 5 than to 1/2 past, and that he had left her, she thought, in something of a hurry, which wasn't like him at all, Miss Marple. He's usually good for a sit and a chat over the rheumatism, being an old friend of my late husband's. The Framptons, for their part, recalled the doctor calling on the baby's cough nearer to 6 than to 5:30, which left, by Miss Marple's careful reckoning, a gap of perhaps 25 minutes, unaccounted for, falling precisely across the hour in which Ivy Colgate had sat down, alone, to a cup of black tea. She should never have needed to take black at all. "It is not proof, Inspector," Miss Marple said, when they had assembled the timings on paper at the Bell and Plough that evening. "A gap of 25 minutes proves nothing but that a busy man was, for once, a little less busy than usual. But it fits where Mr. Sedge's absence at 6:30 did not fit the hour of death. Dr. Instone's absence at nearer 5 o'clock fits it exactly." "Motive's the trouble," Merrow said. "Sedge had a fortune and a false name to protect. Instone's a respected man, comfortable, well-liked. What would Ivy Colgate have on him worth killing over?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup slowly on its saucer. "You mentioned to me once, quite early on, that Dr. Instone had signed a death certificate some years back for an elderly patient. Under circumstances a sharp-eyed postmistress might have found worth remembering. I did not think much of it at the time. One hears of such things, and they are very often nothing at all. But I think, Inspector, that it is time we found out precisely whose death certificate it was, and precisely what was in it that a doctor might not wish to examine too closely." Chapter 15. Old Mrs. Latimer's Will. The name, when Merrow ran it to ground through the parish register, and a rather uncomfortable half-hour with the county coroner's old records, was Mrs. Edith Latimer, a wealthy, reclusive widow who had died in Wren's Hollow 4 years before, attended in her last illness by Dr. Instone alone, and who had, in the final weeks of her life, changed her will to leave a substantial legacy not to her estranged nephew in Canada, but to the doctor who had cared for her so faithfully. It was, on its face, nothing more sinister than gratitude. Such things happened. Old women without close family were not unknown to reward a kind doctor above an absent relation. But the death certificate, when Merrow finally obtained a copy, listed the cause of death as heart failure, and a note in the margin, added later in a different hand, recorded that the family solicitor, reviewing the estate some months afterward, had queried whether an inquest ought to have been held, given the suddenness of the decline and the timing of the changed will, and had been told by the same Dr. Instone that no such inquest was necessary. No inquest had been held, the legacy had been paid, and for 4 years nothing more had been said of it at all. "It isn't proof of murder," Merrow said, laying the papers out. "It's proof of a doctor who benefited handsomely from a patient's death and perhaps discouraged an inquest he'd every professional right to discourage. Half the coroners in the country would call that nothing at all." "It is not proof of murder," Miss Marple agreed, "but it is proof of exactly the sort of thing a woman like Ivy Colgate would notice and remember. A solicitor's letter, perhaps, passing through her post office, querying the very question the margin note records. A woman who sorted every letter in this village for 11 years would have seen that query arrive, and seen, perhaps, that it never seemed to trouble the doctor at all, and wondered why. And if she wondered aloud to the wrong person, or worse, if she let the doctor himself know that she wondered, then I think we have, at last, a motive that fits every fact we have gathered. A man with a comfortable, respectable life, built, in part, on a legacy he could not afford to have questioned again, 4 years on, by a nosy neighbour with a talent for remembering exactly which letters passed through which hands. We've no confession, no witness, nothing but a gap in his afternoon and an old margin note that might mean nothing at all." "No," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup with the particular calm of a woman who has, in fact, already decided how the remaining distance is to be crossed. "But I think, Inspector, that we have the harvest supper in 4 days' time, and I think that if we are patient a little longer, we shall not need a confession offered freely. We shall only need to give a frightened man one small reason to offer it himself." Chapter 16. The Harvest Supper. The harvest supper at Wren's Hollow was held, as it had been held for longer than anyone could precisely remember, in the church hall, strung with the last of the season's corn dollies, and lit, that year, by paraffin lamps borrowed from 3 different households, since the hall's own supply had proved, on inspection, disgracefully low. Nearly the whole village came, as it always did, Mrs. Ashby with a Victoria sponge she pronounced superior to the vicar's wife's, the Yarrows with young Tommy scrubbed pink and miserable in his good collar, Netta Pryor and Peter Coyle sitting, this year, quite openly together, and Mr. Walter Sedge, tending a table of vegetable marrows he had grown himself, looking a good deal less haunted than he had a fortnight before, having been, at last, quietly and privately cleared by the inspector of everything but an old name and an older shame. He had not, after all, any need to keep secret from people who had already decided to like him regardless. Dr. Instone came too, as he always came, moving between tables with his usual easy warmth, admiring marrows, inquiring after rheumatism, accepting a slice of Mrs. Ashby's sponge with every appearance of a man entirely at his ease. Miss Marple, seated near the long trestle table with the tea-urn, watched him for some while before she rose, made her way through the crowd with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, and set it down, quite deliberately, on the table before him. "For you, Dr. Instone. A little late, I'm afraid, but I thought you ought to have it. Ivy Colgate's own recipe book, found among the parlour things that survived the fire. I understand you were rather fond of her blackberry preserve. She always did say you took 2 spoonfuls where anyone sensible would take 1. It was a small, ordinary thing to say, the sort of thing said at a dozen tables that evening about a dozen small kindnesses of the dead, and for anyone not watching closely, it would have passed entirely unremarked. But Miss Marple was watching closely, and so, from a careful distance by the tea-urn, was Inspector Merrow, and both of them saw the same thing happen in the same half-second. Dr. Instone's hand, reaching for his teacup, stopped very slightly in the air, and the easy warmth in his face went, for just a moment, entirely still. "I didn't know she kept a book," he said, and his voice, though he mastered it quickly, had lost its usual comfortable pitch. "I'm sure I never mentioned any particular fondness for her preserve to you, Miss Marple. Didn't you?" Miss Marple's own voice remained perfectly mild. "How strange. I could have sworn someone told me so, though I find at my age one's memory for such small things grows less reliable by the year. I dare say I imagined it." She smiled and turned, unhurried, back toward her own table, and it was only afterward, when the doctor was seen to leave his half-eaten sponge and step out, alone and rather too quickly, into the cold churchyard air, for what he told Mrs. Pym was a breath before the speeches, that Inspector Merrow followed him out, with Constable Purbrick a discreet 10 paces behind. Chapter 17. In the churchyard. The fog had come up again by 9 o'clock, thinner than on the night Ivy Colgate died, but enough to soften the church tower to a grey shape against a greyer sky, and enough, Miss Marple thought, following at her own unhurried pace some minutes behind the inspector, to lend the whole scene a strange, hushed unreality, as though the village had stepped back a fortnight in time to finish something it had left undone. She found Dr. Instone standing by the lich gate, his back to the hall, his shoulders set in the particular rigid line of a man holding himself together by will alone, and Inspector Merrow a few feet off, saying nothing at all, only waiting, the way a good fisherman waits once the line has gone taut. "You needn't say anything, Doctor," Merrow said at last, quietly. "Not here, not now, if you'd rather have your solicitor present. But I think you know why I've followed you out, and I'd rather hear it from you than piece it together from margin notes and gaps in an afternoon." For a long moment Dr. Instone said nothing at all, and the only sound was the distant scrape of chairs being set out in the hall behind them, and somewhere off in the dark, an owl. "She knew," he said finally, and his voice had none of its usual warmth left in it, only a kind of flat, exhausted honesty, the voice of a man too tired to keep performing a part he had worn for 4 years. "Not everything, but enough." A solicitor's letter came through her office, querying the certificate, asking whether there oughtn't to have been an inquest into Edith Latimer's death, given the will changed so late and so sudden. Ivy read it. Of course she read it. She read everything. And she never said a word to the solicitor, or to the coroner, or to anyone in authority at all. She came to me instead. "Blackmail," said Merrow, not unkindly, only stating the fact. She never called it that. She called it an understanding between neighbours, a little something toward the shop's upkeep now and again, in exchange for her continued discretion. It began small. It did not stay small. He turned, at last, to face them, and in the lamplight from the hall, his face looked older than Miss Marple had ever seen it. "I did not kill Edith Latimer, Inspector. I want that understood above everything else. She was dying already. Her heart had been failing for months, and I gave her nothing but what any doctor gives a dying woman in pain. The will was her own choosing. She was grateful, and she was without a family who deserved her gratitude, and I did not ask for a penny of it. But I did not report the query when it came, because I knew how it would look, 4 years on, dredged up and picked over by people who hadn't sat with her through those last nights the way I had. And Ivy Colgate knew exactly how much that fear was worth to me, and she took from it, every month, for 2 years, more than I could well afford, and showed no sign of ever stopping. "And so you stopped her instead," said Miss Marple, very gently, from where she stood a little apart. Dr. Instone looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face seemed almost to loosen, as though the worst part, not the confession, but the concealment, was finally, unbearably over. I told myself, walking to her back door that evening, that I only meant to ask her, one last time, to stop, to appeal to whatever was left of decency in her, but I had the tincture with me. I don't fully know why, except that some part of me had already decided, before I ever knocked, what I meant to do if she refused. She did refuse. She laughed at me, actually, said I'd pay what she asked for as long as she asked for it, or she'd see the whole county asking questions about Edith Latimer's last week alive. I put it in the preserve while she went to fetch a shawl against the evening chill. It was the last ordinary thing I ever did as an ordinary man, Inspector, and I have not drawn an easy breath since. "And the tea, black, no milk fetched," Miss Marple said quietly. "You made it for her yourself, I think, while she was gone for her shawl. A small kindness, meant to hurry things along and have you gone before she'd finished it. You didn't know, or didn't think, that she took milk." "I didn't think of the milk at all," he said, and it was, of everything he said that night, the detail that seemed to cost him the most to admit. Not the poison, not the years of paid silence, but the small, stupid, human failure of a man who had known a woman for 11 years and never once noticed how she took her tea. "I have thought of nothing else since you set that book down in front of me tonight, Miss Marple. I knew, the moment you said the word preserve, that you knew. I don't know how. I have gone over every hour of that evening 1,000 times, and I cannot see where I left the trace." "You left several," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, "but it was the milk, in the end, that told me most clearly. A small, ordinary absence, in a life built almost entirely out of small, ordinary observances. I have found, in a great many years of watching people, Dr. Instone, that it is very rarely the dramatic thing that undoes a person. It is almost always the small one, the cup someone forgot to fill, the flowers someone forgot to water, the single evening a man's habits failed to match his account of himself. Guilt is a poor housekeeper. It so rarely remembers the details an innocent life keeps without even trying. Chapter 18. What Remained. The fire that had briefly threatened the post office parlour, Dr. Instone admitted before the night was out, had been his own doing too, a desperate, clumsy attempt, on the Sunday evening, to search the dresser for any further papers of Ivy Colgate's that might touch on the Latimer matter, abandoned in a panic and covered, badly, with a match set to spilled paraffin when he heard Constable Purbrick's step on his round. He was taken to the county town the following morning, quietly, without the drama the village had half hoped for, and entirely unequal to what it received instead. Not a monster, unmasked at a dramatic gathering, but a tired, frightened man walking to a police car in the grey morning light, past rose beds and marrow patches, and a church hall still strung with the corn dollies from the night before. Wren's Hollow settled, in the weeks that followed, the way villages generally do, not into forgetting quite, but into a kind of careful new normal, in which Dr. Instone's name was mentioned less and less, and the surgery was taken over, within the month, by a brisk young doctor from Leeds who knew nothing of Edith Latimer or Ivy Colgate, and asked no questions about either. Mr. Sedge, Whitlow, as the whole village now knew him to be, without seeming to think much the worse of him for it, went on watering his roses at 6 o'clock precisely, and was seen, before the year was out, walking rather often in the company of Mrs. Ashby, who had decided, apparently, that a man who had spent 3 years growing hybrid teas to hide from an old shame was owed a certain amount of forgiveness for both. Netta Pryor kept the shop, with Peter Coyle's help on Saturdays, and the two of them were married the following spring in a ceremony the whole village agreed was a good deal happier than anything that had preceded it. Miss Marple pruned her own roses that autumn with her usual unhurried thoroughness, and when Inspector Merrow called on her one last time before returning to the county town to thank her, somewhat awkwardly, for what he called her uncommon eye for the ordinary, she only smiled and offered him a final cup of tea. "It is not as uncommon as you think, Inspector," she said, pouring. "Most people look at a life and see only its grand moments, the wills, the quarrels, the secrets worth a headline, but a life is built, almost entirely, out of small, repeated things. A rose watered at 6, a spoonful of milk, a knife laid just so across a jar. Change one of those small things, even slightly, and you have told me something true about a person, whether they meant to or not. I have found, over a long life of watching people who thought themselves unwatched, that the truth very rarely announces itself. It only waits, quite patiently, in the gap between what someone does every day and what they did, just once, on the one day it mattered most." Outside her window, the last of the autumn light lay gold across the lane, and somewhere down toward the church, faint and ordinary, came the sound of Mr. Sedge's watering can, striking the standpipe at exactly 6 o'clock, as it always did, as though nothing in Wren's Hollow had ever gone wrong at all.